Since my colleague prefers speculation to fact, let me just give you the facts. Indeed, if you examine the entire case of the prosecution that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered, it's entirely based on conjecture, speculation, and hypothesis. The government releases hours of videos. They claim that a couple of minutes are missing, and something must have happened during those minutes. They don't know what. They claim all kinds of things: murder, hitman, unlocked doors, and widespread conspiracies. But really, ladies and gentlemen, it will not do. The case for the defense: that Jeffrey Epstein, overcome with legal woes and inside an inhumane prison, provides you with facts. The murder proponents provide you with conjectures. The count of medical examiners who, after examining Epstein's medical file, declare his death to be most probably a suicide is 5. There are 3 who declare it to be undetermined. And the only medical doctor who claims that it is most likely homicide was paid by the Epstein family. And he's outnumbered 5-1 by his fellow professionals. Now, I'm not claiming that those are insurmountable odds or that Dr. Michael Baden does not have a high reputation in his field. It's just that 4 of those medical examiners don't work for the city of New York or have any financial ties to the Epstein family. The proponents of the murder claim the government investigators did not speak to all the inmates in the MCC. Fine. But the investigators did speak to over a dozen MCC inmates, and none of them provided any credible information on a possible murder. We're going to provide you with the real, actual words spoken by those prisoners, staff, and guards at the prison that day. Quote, "You killed him. You weren't making rounds. You killed him." When the electronics technician, the person in charge of fixing that broken video system but didn't do it, was interviewed, he claimed that that entire day, August the 10th, 2019, inmates were screaming at him and other guards, "You killed him. You weren't making rounds. You killed him." Quote from their report: "The electronics technician said that when they were delivering food to the inmates, he heard the inmates saying, 'You killed him. You weren't making rounds. You killed him.' The electronics technician told the OIG, that's Office for Inspector General Investigators, that's the report I'm quoting from, that the inmates also told him that Thomas and Noel, those were the correctional officers on there at that time, just sat at the SHU's officer station and never checked on the inmate." And this is true. We can see that on the video. The electronics technician told the OIG he understood the inmates to be saying that Thomas, and Noel were indirectly responsible for Epstein's death because they had not conducted rounds during their shift. The electronics technician said he believed that Epstein took his own life and said that he had no reason to believe otherwise. Unquote. And that's consistent with interviews of the 3 inmates who were on the L tier with Epstein that night who did actually consent to be interviewed. They made errors or contradicted the guard in details of the discovery of Jeffrey Epstein's body in the morning, but they all stated that they had heard nothing that night. No intruder or footsteps down the hall. And they, all 3 of those inmates who were interviewed, thought Epstein had killed himself. Here's another quote from that OIG report. Quote, "Additionally, the inmates who were interviewed consistently reported that on the evening Epstein died, the SHU staff did not systematically conduct the required rounds and counts, which was one of the primary mechanisms for the SHU staff to ensure the safety and security of inmates housed in the SHU. As a result, Epstein was unmonitored and locked alone in his cell for hours with an excess amount of linens, which provided him an opportunity for him to commit suicide." Unquote. Now, in the Crime Waves episodes, we did interviews with a couple of high-level drug dealers turned cooperators. And they spent years inside the American prison system and the MCC. And they consistently say Epstein probably killed himself. In fact, when I first asked them that question, homicide or suicide, they both started laughing. To them, veterans of the MCC, the idea that it was murder conducted in such a subtle way that it could be confused with suicide was funny. There's another inmate who says the same thing. But William Mercy was on the suicide watch with Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, he was the inmate coordinator tasked with scheduling other inmates to observe suicidal prisoners like Jeffrey Epstein. In his time there, he witnessed an attempted suicide when a prisoner managed to hide razors in his hair and slit his wrist open in the cells. He writes about the non-active intervention of the guards while the inmates abuse and taunt them for failing to find the razors. Now, William Mercy was tasked with observing Jeffrey Epstein. He spoke to him for hours inside the MCC suicide watch after Epstein's alleged earlier suicide attempt. Mercy liked Epstein, describes him as charming and polite, and they spoke about investments, driving taxis in New York. Epstein claimed to have driven a New York cabbie when he was a young man. And Mercy writes all about this in a relatively unseen blog. None of the mainstream media has picked up on this. It's on Medium, and he's completed a book. It's excellent. I strongly recommend it. It's called Doing Time: My Year at MCC Federal Prison with Jeffrey Epstein and Paul Manafort. And it's a strong recommendation to read because he writes with no agenda or slant in his political views on the MCC or Epstein. And this is what he writes. Quote, the very last night I ever saw Jeffrey Epstein was the only time he struck me as depressed and possibly suicidal. I reported for work and I found him sitting on the stone floor with his back on his bunk while eating the prison food given him out of a styrofoam plate that was sitting between his legs. Jeffrey, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you eating on the floor? It's just easier this way, was his response. Kind of made sense. But he did strike me as resolved to his fate that night. He'd recently been denied bail and was facing the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars, even if he snitched on whoever else was included in his pedophilic quests. And what I thought might be the end of the Jeffrey Epstein story was in some ways just the beginning. Speculation as to whether Epstein killed himself or was murdered in some sort of conspiracy run wild. I didn't see how anybody could get into his shoe cell and kill him without several people being involved. And that conspiracy would unravel quickly under investigation. I assumed he killed himself. And that assumption was reinforced when a knucklehead, I'll call inmate White, returned from the shoe to contribute his 2 cents to the debate. Quote, while there, he was housed in the cell next door to, drumroll, Jeffrey Epstein. And when White was released from the shoe and returned to our unit, he reported to me that nobody came in or out of the tier that night, and that at some point in the wee hours, he had heard the sound of sheets tearing from Jeffrey Epstein's cell, a cell in which he had been left all alone after his bunkie had been returned to general population. And his conclusion was that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. Nobody killed him. And White was most emphatic in the statement. He had no agenda in saying this, and I have no reason not to believe him. And to this day, I believe Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. Of that, I have little doubt. Unquote. They were incompetent. They were fatally, near murderously incompetent, but they were not the killers in this particular case. That's the consistent message of all the MCC guards, staff, and inmates interviewed by government investigators. Epstein killed himself. Now, you'd think that one of them would express some doubt on this version of the story, but consistently, they all stated the view that it was self-harm. Why? Why did many of the people who actually lived and worked inside that MCC think that Jeffrey Epstein's death was a suicide? Because they know the truth. They know the awful, unspeakable truth about that institution, the one that few in the New York legal and media establishment want anyone to know about. It was a torture center. It was designed to break prisoners, to make them sign deals with the prosecution to get them out of that hellhole. And when I use those words, torture center, I'm not embellishing. Independent monitors, not defense lawyers, but Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, even the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, all said those inhumane conditions inside the MCC, specifically the SHU unit where Epstein was placed. Those two former Mexican drug cartel members who served over 14 years in the U.S. prison system said on Crime Waves, of all the prisons that they were in, that special housing unit of the MCC was the worst. It was deliberately maintained hellhole. And the government doesn't want you to know that story. They fed out the idea after Epstein was found dead that he'd committed suicide to their pliant little chums in the corporate media, but they didn't provide any details about the conditions inside that prison. It was only in the local independent media, the New York outlets like the Gothamists, that we looked at. They have been writing about this situation for years, and they found that no one had cared about it because all the people affected were mostly, whether they were innocent or guilty, poor. All this was done. That system was maintained so that powerful New York politicians could go to their liberal fundraisers and say platitudes about inequality, inclusion, and diversity, while they went to other fundraisers and they talked from the other side of their mouths about getting tough on crime, where their numbers of solved cases was so high. So to repeat, the MCC was a deliberately maintained prosecution deal factory, and it had broken men with longer and more extensive criminal backgrounds than Jeffrey Epstein. Chapo Guzman went mad in that institution. He's got to be arguably the toughest, most methodical killer and gangster of the Western Hemisphere. He's a man who ordered the killings and tortures of thousands of people. He'd lived for years inside a Mexican high-security prison. He'd been on the run from authorities for decades. But he, Chapo Guzman, according to his own defense lawyers, cracked within months of being inside the SHU at the MCC. So to repeat, the issue was, for the most part, the MCC prisoners were working-class men who had no power or influence. And as far as the establishment were concerned, they could live or die like shit-covered rats, and no one, besides their own family, cared. And I say shit-covered rats deliberately, and I'm sorry to use such language, but it's an accurate wording of the Jeffrey Epstein's life inside the MCC. That place crawled with bugs and rats. I read you the description in that episode, The Case for the Defense, where a prisoner was bitten by a rat, and the MCC guards wouldn't let him see a doctor until his hand had swollen up. And we know that these conditions affected Jeffrey Epstein. In the final words that he gives to the world, it's a scrawled, handwritten note that ends, quote, "giant bugs crawling over my hands, no fun," unquote. The food he was given was many times literally shit. And again, I'm not using that term lightly. This is what the other prisoners who worked in the MCC kitchen would put in the food packets for a sex offender in the SHU. If they were lucky, other times the inmates would put in cockroaches and rats. And all of this got to Jeffrey Epstein. And we know it did. Again, the prosecution, they talk about theories about murderers and hitmen, but the facts are clear. On July 23rd, his roommate in his cell screamed to get the guards that Epstein had tried to kill himself in the middle of the night. Epstein was then put on suicide watch because of it. And the prosecution will point out that the inmate was a corrupt cop who would be convicted of murdering 4 of his associates, at least one by tying a plastic zip tie around his neck after he'd tied up their wrists. Yes, that's a method very similar to the one that could have killed Epstein. Fine. But it doesn't explain why that corrupt, drug-smuggling, convicted cop murderer and his defense lawyer summoned the guards. If it intended to harm Epstein, if it had been paid off by someone to kill Epstein, why would he shout and summon help? It makes no sense. Particularly in the light of Jeffrey Epstein's other actions in the days before his death. On August 8th, 2 days before he was found dead in his cell, he made a new will. Why? Why would he take time out of his legal defense to get himself out of that hellhole to make a new will? These are the facts, unlike anything presented in the case for murder. We've documented evidence of everything leading to a verdict of self-harm, because Jeffrey Epstein's life was just about to get even worse. He'd been denied bail. Despite Epstein offering the richest financial bond in U.S. legal history, Jeffrey Epstein was not going anywhere. He was destined to stay in the MCC until his trial. And on Friday, August 9th, the day after Epstein made a new will, came the release of the Ghislaine Maxwell documents. Thousands of pages detailing Jeffrey Epstein's sex life, and more importantly, opening him up to previously uncharged crimes with no statute of limitations. The system had just got his buddy, Harvey Weinstein, and put him in jail. We know that Jeffrey Epstein wrote a letter to Larry Nassar. That's the doctor at the center of the sexual abuse case at Team USA Gymnastics. So, on the night of August 9th, 2019, due to MCC incompetence, Jeffrey Epstein was alone in his cell for the very first time in 6 weeks. There was no other watching eyes, no other person in close proximity. He had just made a last phone call with his then-girlfriend, Karina Shuliak, a woman who had kept loyal to him for years. And we've interviewed a number of people close to Jeffrey Epstein in the production of this series. All of them couldn't believe that such a man would kill himself. But that's the way of many deaths by self-harm. The family and friends are taken completely by surprise. So on that night, Jeffrey Epstein would look around his room and see large cockroaches. The guards had treated him badly. The food was awful. And we know that these things were on his mind. This isn't like the case for murder. It's not conjecture. We have his last note scrawled with ballpoint pen. Epstein wasn't supposed to have that pen, but it read, quote, "They kept me in a locked shower for 1 hour. Noel sent me burnt food. Giant bugs crawling over my hands. No fun." That would be Jeffrey Epstein's life from now on. A 50-foot prison cell covered in bugs. And perhaps he thought, why not go now, with some control over my exit? Why not keep peace with my friends and business associates by silencing myself? And in my suicide, I give them a gift of myself.